Welcome to a presentation on the future of neurotechnology and in particular, how can we rethink and use so-called real-time closed-loop neurostimulation to treat neurological conditions. So how does the driving technology look like? Nowadays, we have a variety of different technologies that we can consider in order to interact with the brain or peripheral nervous system. And here are some of those cases. Some are based on transmagnetic stimulation, some others based on electrical stimulation. But ultimately, this technology has the promise to actually change the lives of millions and millions of people, for instance, either in epilepsy, chronic pain, among other different applications. Nonetheless, there is a limiting fact to this driving technology, which is it has to learn how to drive. So in particular, what I mean by this is the aim of this technology is to interact with our nervous system to change the way activity is being produced from an abnormal state to something that is further apart from abnormal state. And my agenda today is actually the following 3 points. First, we're going to look at how things are done today. And then we're going to look into more interesting aspects and connecting with it has to learn how to drive, which is, okay, what would happen if we do this in the context of driving, and then go from driving to actually use these lessons from driving into the neurostimulation design. Now, let's look into the state of the art. How are things done today? Well, here is one particular example. This is the responsive neurostimulation device by NeuroPace. It looks like this. So basically someone undertakes surgery. This device is deployed. There are some leads here that will go on top of the cortex, some others in deeper in the brain. And usually these devices, they track the activity that is undergoing in the brain. And then there's a specific period where an event is detected. And that event, in this case, is a seizure, which is related to a brief disturbance of electrical functioning. Once this is detected, then the device responds. That's why it is called responsive, in a specific fashion. Now, the only problem about that specific fashion is it responds the same way, despite of the electrical activity that it actually senses. This is not very different from what we often do in the context of medical therapies. For instance, think about yourself, a situation where you're having a headache, and usually you take an aspirin. That aspirin, let's say, has 400 milligrams of the content that you need, paracetamol, and then basically you hope that this 400 or 500 will have an impact. After a few hours, you check if it is impacting the way you wanted, you no longer have a headache, otherwise you take another one. But why would you take the same dose as me or someone else? Why not to have actually a way to measure and dose things accordingly? Being able to actually see or measure, automate the process of defining how much I should provide you over time, depending on your specific metabolism system, your state of mind, and your condition as a whole. And of course, we cannot really do that in the context of aspirin because it goes inside the body and then goes into the bloodstream and it will be very difficult to measure. But that's not the case with these devices that are going to revolutionize the way we actually treat and mitigate neurological diseases. So that's kind of to convey that the same practice that we are playing with medicine is the one that we are applying also here with neurotechnology, which is not surprising, and it has sometimes desirable achievable goals. Now, how does this device actually behave in practice? So here is a specific case with real data collected by one of such devices. And again, there's electrical activity in the brain being measured, so difference of potential. Then there is some activity that looks somewhat problematic. There's an event that is detected as a seizure. And basically, there is a deployment of charges into the brain that aims to disrupt that activity. So during the time these charges are being deployed, well, you won't be able to see anything in terms of the change of the brain dynamics, and then you start noticing a specific variation. If that variation consists still an event that could be problematic or abnormal, then you deploy, again, the same exact sort of stimulus, and you continue to do so until either the activity looks now more normal, or the case where it seems that whatever stimulus you are deploying does not change activity accordingly, and therefore it's pointless and you give up. So, as I mentioned before, what's the problem here? Well, the problem is twofold. First, you are just using the data to detect an event. And you're not using the data to actually decide on how should you actually interact with your brain. And when I say interact, it's more than just interact with your brain, but actually steer it according to a desirable goal, towards a desirable goal that in this case is away from abnormal activity. And with that, I would like to bring up the question I had in the previous slide. Would you drive your car as people nowadays use neurostimulation devices? For instance, put yourself in the shoes of a driver and imagine yourself in one of these four conditions. And you are driving and suddenly there is an obstacle on the way. Would you steer the wheel and press the accelerator or brake accordingly in the exact same fashion in these four different situations? Well, hopefully the answer is no. But if you do so, be aware that there will be some consequences. For instance, in this case over here on the bottom right, well, likely if you press the same way, either you are going to crash with an obstacle that you just faced, or you're going to literally slip away from the road. And similar in other cases, and you could even consider cases where there is ice and things like that on the road. So what exactly do we actually do when we drive? Well, it turns out that our brain is a sort of a predictor. So it tries to consider all possible settings that we are going to face in the future, based on our experience, how things have behaved in the past according to our interactions. In particular, we could see as a sort of combination of our previous experience and expectations, then what is the incoming evidence, and then what would be our reactions that will be basically a combination of these two priors. And we could also see things over time. So here, for instance, you have a case where you have time and we are taking snapshots at different times. And what we do is, okay, I want to be at a certain place, here represented by this red trajectory. And I have interacted with my system using specific sort of inputs and interactions with my system. For instance, steering the wheel and pressing the pedals in my car. That's how I know how my car behaves and create an internal model in my brain about such interactions. And then I measure as I go what would be the place where I'm currently at. And hopefully I'll be able to be exact same point where I want to be. But again, this is based on how we construct sort of a model in our brain. But then we want to do actually the inferred estimate, or we want to think about how things will behave in the future. And our brain is really good at doing that, so basically creates a sort of scenarios that are possible. So this will be actually the ground truth, but before I actually went to that ground truth, I forecasted different trajectories. And as I get in the way of my ground truth, I rethink which actions are actually going to take me to the right place. And that's exactly what we do in the second half of what we refer as model predictive control, which is we use this kind of internal understanding on how the model works, and then we try to anticipate what is the sequence of movements, for instance, in driving, steering the wheel and pressing the brake and accelerator pedals, and how this is going to steer my car towards a desirable goal, in particular a specific route on the lane or on the road. And you could actually imagine the follow-up to this, which is, well, we actually reassess our decisions very, very often. You can actually see, for instance, in this example, this is more or less how we actually proceed when we actually want to pass a specific car. So we start kind of steering the wheel to the left in this case, then we press the accelerator or keep the velocity more or less constant, then we steer to the right to have the car on the right trajectory, and off we go. But we don't do this blindly. We see how the car is responding to, we incorporate visual feedback, and then we readapt our movements accordingly, such that we are sure that we are where we want to be. So if you're not convinced yet, now it's your turn to try to actually perform model predictive control. So here is what I want to do. You probably have seen this test before. So basically, you have with your eyes closed to bring your finger to your nose. And I want you to do that a couple of times. To feel comfortable doing so, again, close your eyes, move your finger slowly to your nose. Don't try to do it too fast. In fact, the slowest you do it, the harder it is. And it turns out that if you do this exercise, you feel that as you are doing it, you are basically trying to anticipate, oh, okay, where exactly is my finger? wait, I'm getting closer. Maybe I should get a bit up or down, and there's where I should be, and there I am. So there's this kind of prediction control, prediction control, prediction control that is implicit in this model predictive control scheme. And hopefully you did the exercise in the right way and you didn't get into any of these two situations. Hopefully I didn't. So that said, how can we actually bring this understanding on how model predictive control can be applied in the context of neurostimulation? And here I mentioned automated driving or autonomous driving, but again, the same principles apply on our daily driving. So you could assume that we are the ones on the driver's seat. Yet, in the context of these neurostimulation devices, they are autonomous in nature. So you cannot expect a physician or biomedical engineer to be there on your side all the time, performing the decisions for the device. So the device has to incorporate a sequence of rules that would allow to have and create this sort of internal model, predict things according to the stimulation, and then steer things away from where they are supposed to be. And this is kind of the infographics that will capture what we are trying to do. So we want to create a sort of a proxy for how the neural activity behaves, and that neural activity will then be used as a model, and that model will allow us to figure out how control and prediction work together. And of course, we want to be sure that as we make decisions, we are away from abnormal behavior. In the case of the seizures, we can kind of try to force the activity to be within a certain range. Now, I would argue that by doing this, we became more efficient in the sense that, well, we know how exactly we would like to provide the stimulus rather than just providing a stimulus that may not be necessary and may, in fact, be harmful. The stimulus itself can actually aggravate the neurological condition because we are also kind of figuring out what to do at each time. And this, for instance, electrical stimulation consists in deploying and removing electrical charges. We're actually saving battery. And of course, the combination of these two leads to better care in the sense that, well, the person will probably experience shorter duration of seizures or no seizures whatsoever, at least not symptomatic. And second, having batteries that last long lead people to not go to the OR as often, because often these batteries have to be removed through surgery. So that is also something that will allow people to have a higher quality of life. All this I said, everybody can agree. But there is one point, which is the model. What kind of model do I have in mind? And no pun intended, the brain model that I have in mind actually is building upon a lot of evidence that suggests that the sort of activity that goes from the very low local level of a neuron to a more higher level of a mesoscopic brain follow properties that are related to the so-called fractional order systems or dynamics or networks. But before we go there, it is important to emphasize that every model has its limitations. And we are not at all providing or claiming that we have a model that will capture exactly how the brain works. That's actually not our goal. What we want is a model that is able to capture partial behavior or activity and be able to steer actions accordingly. That said, how does these fractional models look like? Well, it turns out that if I look at a simulated process by such fractional systems, this is one possible signal I'll obtain. And this signal actually could be, why not, some brain signal, some difference of potential that is observed at the sensor in the stimulation device we just saw before. It turns out that this signal has very particular properties. In particular, if I look at the sample autocorrelation function, I can see that it decays following a so-called power law. And it can follow like this way, that is very nice and takes like forever. By the way, for those of you who may not really know what this is about, well, autocorrelation function tries to measure the impact or dependency of a current state based on all the previous current states. Things that would be very clear in terms of example is if you drop a stone in a lake or in a pond, then basically it will create waves. And depending on how many stones and you drop it at a specific location, you have then different combination of patterns. So the patterns will depend on time and space. And that's kind of what fractional orders often capture, is this sort of interplay between space and time. Now, here we are just looking at time, and you can see that there is a lot of dependency from the past. So for this process alone, well, we have dependence on at least 100, but of course, this will continue on and on. It can be exhibiting things like this, but it could be also things that will oscillate around this. The important thing is that the entire cone will follow this sort of power law decay. That said, there are a bunch of different, more simplistic models that we could actually deploy. And one of those models that people often like to consider is the so-called autoregressive model. The autoregressive model tells you that, well, if you have a specific state at the time k, that state will be a linear combination given by the a1 to ak minus 1 of the previous states. And here you can see that, well, we are considering all the states from the very beginning. It turns out that if I assume that such weights are actually going to be dependent on a specific function, in particular this function phi I depict over here, well, it turns out that they will depend only on this parameter alpha I over here. And this alpha I is actually what we refer as fractional order derivative, or discrete fractional order derivative. So what is this sort of derivative intuitively? So we like to assume that we have a good understanding of derivatives as a whole. They usually try to capture a rate of change. For instance, when we are driving our car, we assume that, well, the velocity is basically the difference between any 2 points that are arbitrarily close, and that gives you an approximation of the velocity. In fact, that's all what you have to see when you're driving your car. Well, the fractional order is basically telling that the rate of change, it does not depend just on 2 different periods of time, but rather on a combination of all the periods of time from the past. And that is what this fractional coefficient or exponent alpha I is trying to capture through this function phi that basically defines all the parameters from the initial state up to the previous state. And you can see here how these things look like. You can see actually that the weights kind of decay in a power law fashion as well. So let's do a slightly different exercise. So let's suppose that I'm going to consider different alphas from 0, that is what we refer as white noise, and increase it up to 1. And you can see how the processes look like. So you can see that for the ones that usually have a higher coefficient, there's some sort of more like slow oscillatory behavior. Whereas, for instance, the white noise, well, there's almost no slow variation, but really high frequency variation. And everything else in between is kind of captured by that. And you can see the signal to be actually the accumulation of the impact of different noises over time. So this is basically what the delta alpha I is trying to capture, is the accumulation over time given a specific dependency in the past. By the way, one thing I didn't mention, and that's the reason why this figure is here, is that actually the fractional calculus, which is basically inspiration for this sort of time series analysis, was derived by Sir Clive Granger, won actually the Nobel Prize in economics in 2003. It's good to refer this because we are currently at the season where the economic prizes are being awarded, so keep that in mind. That said, we spoke about time, but we haven't yet spoke about multiple time scales. And that's trying to capture different temporal behavior we can experience in a more complex network. For instance, this network over here could consider some parts of your brain, and you could assume that these nodes will correspond to a specific bundle of neurons. And then you try to see how the activity evolves over time. And you say, okay, the activity over time for the different nodes will vary according to different fractional coefficients, here depending on alpha 1 to alpha n. Whereas the state will be captured then by this x, and of course this process will be then driven by some noise. Yet, here I only have time. I don't have spatial dependency, but this is a network, which means that nearby nodes will affect the dynamics of remaining nodes. So I should also be able to consider spatial dependencies. And in fact, that is what I'm trying to capture here with this matrix A. That will, of course, depend on underlying graph calligraphic G. But of course, one has also to consider that, well, the activity will change depending on my interactions. Remember, we are going to talk about neurostimulation, so I'm going to interact with these dynamics. And we can assume that these arrows here would correspond to that interaction, that control. And it is important to emphasize that that control actually is underlying all sorts of channels throughout time, because this stimulation, since the process will have some memory, will be propagating within the system. So if I, at time 0, inject something here, it will be at time 1 and 2 around these nodes, and as time evolves, may affect a much larger quantity of nodes. So that is something that is important. But ultimately, what I want to present you right now is that this is the kind of model we are considering. So temporal variations, different rates of changes. In fact, there's a lot of evidence regarding the different regions of the brain have a sort of different frequency. It turns out that this alpha is kind of capturing to some extent that, but more on the memory dependencies. So there are kind of dual approaches to study this problem. It has a matrix A that mixtures the signals that have been generated at different locations in the brain, for instance, and then this reflects what kind of electrical activity could be deployed in the specific region of the brain, and of course it will propagate throughout to the remaining regions. That said, this is the kind of model we have for our brain. In fact, not really for our brain again, because I'm not trying to model the brain, but rather what would be the behavior I can experience. And again, this is the same you do when you're driving your car. So I don't want to model the dynamics of the car. I don't care, as long as I have an internal model that allows me to drive the car, and the car responds the way I want it to be responding. So that's exactly what this fractional model then does, is to capture how the activity that is being measured would vary, and thus this model is capable of capturing that variation. If that's the case, then we can actually think about control, and the model predictive control that we did before, but just to kind of present some of the math behind, we could see it in this way. So we want to minimize the specific cost. Here, usually we have two components, one that is the state, the other one that is the input, and we want to balance that. We don't want to stimulate too much the brain, and also usually we want to drive this state to be within a specific bound such that does not correspond to abnormal activity. X will be then the different areas of the brain that we are observing, the model dynamics that I just described, where it's going to be affected by both the input that I inject in the brain, as well as the noise that is affecting the dynamics already as it goes. And then there could be other constraints, both in the X, such that I say that I don't want X to be more than a certain amount, or also in terms of the inputs. In fact, this is a constraint that is of utmost importance when we speak about medical conditions, because these devices don't have many software restrictions. In other words, the hardware is allowed to give a specific input, and the safe mechanisms that are underneath do not allow to give you more than that input. And those are bounds that are established based on how much heat is going to generate, because it could actually harm your neural system. That's why usually having fevers or high fevers is not advisable. So the same applies here. So as long as you change things and you are within those constraints on the input, things that are on the rate of variation, as well as how much input you are providing and on how often you're providing that input, you can pretty much do whatever you want. So that's kind of what we have here as a constraint. And on top of that, there's also a medical constraint, which is so-called charge neutrality, meaning that whatever quantity of stimulus I provide in, or electrical charges, I have to withdraw them once I am done. Why? Because I want to keep the balance in terms of electrical stimulus within the brain. That said, these models, they can become arbitrarily large. So in practice, when we implement these models, we do some tricks. So basically, we actually truncate these models. In other words, we just consider a specific amount of the past to define what's going to happen in the future. And it turns out that, experimentally speaking, we don't actually need much memory to actually be able to implement successfully these sort of model predictive control schemes. In the context of epileptic seizure mitigation, we often considered this sort of parameters. Again, here I'm also kind of putting a limit on how much I want to provide at any specific amount of time. Yet, you can see here that I didn't explicitly consider the fact that how much electrical stimulus in and out we have to balance, because it is something that we realize that we don't need. In fact, here is one simulation done where we are using one of the main models accepted in the context of the computational neuroscience community and medical community, which is so-called the JSON-RIT. And you can see the variation, and then here you see how the activity would look like in blue, and then how the input that we're injecting in red looks like, and also in green, how the actuated signal looks like. So let's zoom in a bit, and you can see that, in fact, if I'm actually looking at a window of time, and I see how much is going up in red and how much it goes down, it turns out that it looks actually close to zero. In other words, the amount of electrical energy I provide in is the same I'm removing over time on average. So the difference is that if I consider implicitly that constraint, and of course we should consider, it takes more time, but it was interesting, and that's the reason I also kind of wanted to emphasize this aspect. And again, did we achieve the goal that the green signal will be within a specific band? The answer is yes. You can see that when we switch on the device, these different inputs were injected, and the control signal is within a specific bound. By the way, I just noticed that I made a mistake. So the green is what you're averaging out to be 0, but also the red, of course, is also averaging out to be 0, which is the control signal, and the red is within a specific band. So the signal is contained and further away from abnormal activity like these peaks over here. Okay, so that said, I introduce you a framework that allows us to look into the neurostimulation devices used to mitigate seizures. But it turns out that these can also be applied in the context of different neurological conditions, for instance, chronic pain. And it turns out that in the case of chronic pain that is due to a neuroma, in other words, there is some sort of nerve damage, and usually there's a mass, and that mass is often associated and responsible for generating a signal that looks like this. So you have basically suboscillatory and then etopic discharges, and those are the things that are believed to create the sensation of pain or interpret as pain in your brain. There are some neurostimulation devices that are deployed on your arm, on your peripheral nervous system, that will then actually provide stimulus in a sort of the same way that we discussed before. So a same stimulus is provided now and then when a specific event is detected. These devices have also more functionality. You can also interact with the device yourself. You can describe different therapeutic plans. But also in these devices, what if we try to use model predictive control using the models I just described? Well, again, we did some in silico experiments, and you can see here how things look like. So you see in red how the signal would look like, and then here in blue you see the control signal. And then in green here you see the actuation signal that is being deployed. And you can see that basically we are able to actually have the blue signal, that is the control signal, to basically be fixed and constant and equal to a specific reference value. So that said, this is one model that is used, again, in computational neuroscience, also very well accepted in the medicine community. We could use other models that are equally valid in the context of pain. And you can see here that same goals are kind of achievable. So the blue will go to a reference value that we wish. So these are at the neuron levels. Of course, we have then to consider how to actually validate these models in real life. And we have done already some testing, and please be advised that there will be some real-life pictures right now. So if for some reason you are more sensitive to some pictures that may include worms and blood, you may want to wait 2 minutes before coming back to the presentation. So that said, here are some real-world testing that was conducted by some of the members in my group. Here we have a worm, and we basically try to consider like 2 needles that will serve as stimulation, and then try to see if we were able to move the worm, measure what we wanted, just as a sort of calibration of the stimulation device. And then, of course, we did some tests in rodents, and in particular tried to see how these different stimulus would be working within the nerve of that rodent. And you can see here that we can see a spike when there is one. And of course, we can then do additional testing to see if there is pain and if we can actually mitigate pain and things like that. Yet, as you may imagine, pain is a difficult to assess criteria in the sense that it's a rather subjective term. But once again, as long as we are even able to assume that rodent has experienced pain, and then we are able to mitigate that pain that is measured using certain criteria, then we are on the right track to actually achieve our desirable goal. That said, there's also some additional testing that you can see. For instance, you can see here how the real data looks like. So basically a lot of noisy data, there's some spiking happening over here, and then of course you can just have no spiking whatsoever. So that said, these are some of the interesting directions that we are using this fractional model predictive control on, again, to equip or enable driving technology to actually drive the results to better outcomes for the patients, such that they actually have their quality of life improved. These were just two of the applications that we're actually currently interested in. In fact, there are other exciting applications also in the context of artificial retina to enable the blind to see once again, among so many others that are really cool. So please, stay tuned, and thank you for watching this presentation. If there are any questions, feel free to reach out to me on this email. If you want to learn more about the technical aspects related to fractional order and personalized neurostimulation, I would like to invite you to go and check our recent survey on the topic. That said, looking forward to see you around.